Hi everyone, thank you for coming. My name is James Allardice. I'm a software engineer working for a large retailer in the UK as a kind of full stack JavaScript engineer. So we're using a lot of Node, a lot of React. And over kind of the last year maybe, we've been working a lot on login and kind of the customer experience around login and around account kind of functionality. So registration and change email address and things along those lines. And while we were going through this exercise, I discovered something called the Credential Management API, which I had never heard of before. No one on my team had ever heard of before. And it seemed to have kind of bypassed everyone. And I'm not sure why, because it really allows for some great kind of user experience improvements in the login process. So today, well this afternoon, we're going to kind of look a bit about what the Credential Management API is, how we can use it. It's quite straightforward. This will hopefully be a nice, easy workshop to finish the day off. I'm sure you're all tired after 2 days of drinking and eating. So am I, so I've still already got a coffee here. So yeah, hopefully nice straightforward one to wrap things up. And maybe a bit of time at the end to think about some ways to take it even further. So, first of all, I'd like to think a bit about how kind of login, the process for login has evolved over time, particularly kind of from the point of view of the browser. There's not been a huge amount of innovation really in this area because it's just login, right? Like what else is there to it? So pretty much since the start of the web, sites have provided simple username and password forms. That this is still the case today. It's unlikely to change in the near future. But there have been some kind of fairly minor but important innovations within browsers to assist users in this process. So for example, browsers will offer to remember your username and your password. They can automatically fill them in some cases. Chrome, for example, here highlights the fields in yellow to show that it has done that. More recently, some browsers, again, Chrome is one of them, will allow you to sync your passwords across devices. If you've logged into your Google account on your phone and on your laptop, I'm sure you've seen this. You're able to share those credentials across your devices. And another potentially more recent one is the concept of federated identity, which is where we as developers can delegate the authentication process to a third party. Maybe Facebook, maybe Twitter, GitHub. Many larger applications now offer us the ability to kind of handle authentication for us. And we then just have to rely on that trust, and the user has to simply remember their one credential to access their one, although like I said, there are now many, but the idea is you have fewer sites that you need to remember credentials for because you just delegate the control to one of those other sites. So this is a technique that's usually seen as an enhancement to that kind of traditional username and password form. You rarely see sites that only offer third-party login, like just only a Facebook button or only a Twitter button. Some do, but you'll usually see this on top of that traditional username and password form. The final, more recent innovation in the area is the Credential Management API, which, kind of like I just suggested was the case for things like federated login, it works really well as an enhancement on top of that traditional username and password form. And we'll see how that works shortly, but it will allow us to enhance that form in some really nice ways and potentially, in some cases, get rid of that form completely. So the Credential Management API is a W3C draft currently, but it is a web standard. Work on the spec started in 2015, and it's been championed by Mike West, an engineer at Google. It provides two key mechanisms, the first of which is to help the user authenticate by providing us access to the credentials that they've previously used to log in. And the second is to help the browser store the credentials provided by the user. We keep using the word credential. In the context of the Credential Management API, a credential is an assertion about an entity which enables a trust decision. A bit of an obtuse definition, but it kind of makes sense. So our assertion, in the case of a traditional form, our assertion is that a unique user identifier, such as an email address or a username, along with a password, can be used to uniquely identify a user, and we can trust that credential means they are who they say they are. The federated credential is another type of that, where we are effectively trusting that a third party has performed that authentication, and if that third party says they are who they say they are, we have that trust decision made. Browser support at the moment for the Credential Management API is not great. This screenshot was taken a couple of months ago, but there is unfortunately still no more green. Chrome has it, pioneered it, and it's stable in Chrome. It's stable in Opera and in Android. And it's under consideration in Edge and in Firefox. So hopefully we will start to see some further support in the not too distant future. There's not been a huge amount of discussion around it recently in Firefox, but I'm hopeful that it will start to pick up, especially as it picks up people using it within Chrome. So the app that we're going to work with today, it's available inside the virtual appliance. It's a simple demo app using Node and Express for a simple server. And this one in the middle is, if you don't recognize it, is Pug, which is the newish name for Jade, which is a simple templating language that kind of Express uses by default. I didn't realize it had changed to Pug fairly recently, but apparently there was someone tried to sue them for using the name Jade, so they had to rename it. So these are some of the technologies we'll be using. It doesn't matter if you haven't used them before. There's not much that we'll need to go into depth with. The vast majority of kind of the framework behind this is already written, so hopefully you'll be able to kind of just follow along from that. If you want to set it up locally, there's a link at the bottom there. You should just need to do an npm install, and that will hopefully be it. But note that you will need Chrome 60 to actually run this in the way we're going to go about it. Chrome 60 is already available inside the virtual appliance, and the code is already checked out inside the virtual appliance, and npm install has already been run. Does anyone need a bit of time to get that cloned and npm installed, or is everyone happy and ready to go? If you've done an npm install, it should be fine. npm start will start the server. You can do start is automatically aliased. You can use either. Sorry, I should have said it's within Summer Camp JS Cred API if you're in the virtual machine. Can everyone see the bottom? I don't think you can see the bottom. There we go. So I will run through some of the structure that we've got here. The app already contains this src source directory, and within that is index.js. And as I said, it sets up a straightforward Express app. I'm scrolling off the bottom of my screen because of the resolution of this projector. Right, let me open it in Sublime. Give up on Vim. So, yeah, in src index.js, down at the bottom, we're starting an Express server, and just up above that, we're setting up a few route handlers that will respond to requests from the browser. Like I said, if you haven't seen any of this before, I wouldn't worry too much. We're not going to change very much in this file, but so you can get an idea of what the application does. We have a get route handler, which will render a login page. We have a post route handler to the same location, so that when we receive a post request from submitting a form, for example, we can do a, sure? Sorry. Is that better? Can everyone see at the back? Yeah, so we're setting up some Express route handlers. For example, here, a get route handler to render the login page, a post route handler to handle a request from a form submission, for example. And in this, we're pulling out the submitted username and password from the request, the submitted request body, and because this is a demo, we're just doing a straight comparison with some hard-coded username and password values, which you can find in the config directory. If the submitted data is what we expect, if it matches what's in the config directory, we set a cookie with an access token, just a random value, and we redirect the request onwards to the dashboard, which we're assuming, well, we're saying is kind of the logged in homepage. So we can run this with npm start from the root directory, which should start the Express app on port 7400. And if we then visit that in Chrome, we should have this very, very straightforward login page. Has everyone got that? Has anyone, a better question would be, has anyone not got that? Cool, good. So that login page has been rendered by this, oh, no, pug syntax highlighting. I'm sorry for using an obscure, potentially obscure templating language, but it's the quickest way to get something like this set up. But so the login page is rendered by this pug file, which is kind of like Haml, if you've ever used Haml and Ruby. But it's we can see that we're setting up here two input fields and a button to submit the form. We also have inside the public directory, public scripts app.js, an empty JavaScript file, which is included on the client side. And that's where we're going to write our client-side code to start enhancing that login form to do some more exciting things. So at the moment, you can try and log in using that form, as we saw. I'll try and zoom in Chrome as well. As we saw in that config file, the credentials are hard-coded to example and password. If I bring this up a bit, you can see that currently we're just performing okay, interesting, example and password. We're just performing a normal form post, and we're redirecting to this dashboard page, which is behind a piece of middleware in Express that checks whether or not we have an access token cookie. So, like I said, it's very much a dummy app, so not something you'd want to ever use in production. There's only one username and password, and we're not actually ever checking the value of the access token. We just check that it exists. If you clear that cookie from the application tab in DevTools under cookies, and you reload the page, you can see that your session is gone, and you'll be redirected back to the login page. Does anyone have any questions at that point? Cool. So the first thing we're going to do is kind of lay some groundwork for the Credential Management API and for some other enhancements that we're going to do first. So I'm sure you've seen in the past the autocomplete attribute on input fields. This is kind of one of the simplest things we can do to enhance, well, not just login forms, but any form. And previously, prior to HTML5, well, prior to the living standard that is now the HTML specification, autocomplete really just kind of had two values, on and off, and the browser kind of had to make a best guess at what to put in those fields. That is no longer the case, and we now have much more control over what values the browser will put into those places. So there's a few examples on the screen now, and that spec linked at the bottom here. You can see there's a huge number of different values that some browsers may use, not all browsers will. Zoom in again on this. Where's the list gone? Yeah, so if the browser knows where to put the value, if it knows it's stored a value that corresponds to a name, we can suggest on any field that it autofills the name. Same for addresses, credit card numbers and data. All sorts of kind of useful user-related data that the browser is able to store if it wants to and if the user allows it to. And it gives us much more control over our forms and over how the browser interacts with them. So in our case, our simple login form, we're only going to need the first two at the moment. We can use autocomplete username on our username field, self-explanatory, and we can use current password on the password field. the reason we need current password is that the new password value is for when you're changing a password. So the browser knows that on a login form, it needs the user's current password. So also hopefully fairly self-explanatory. So let's go ahead and add those autocomplete attributes into the login page template. So that's the login pug file. And we just need to add autocomplete equals username and autocomplete equals current password. And if we save that, unfortunately, we have to restart the server because I was silly and didn't put something like nodemon in there to do that for you. But if you restart that server and reload the page, we should then be able to see that we have those attributes in the DOM. So we've got a username, autocomplete username, resolution again, autocomplete of username there. So that will then mean that if the browser was to have data stored that corresponds to those autocomplete values, it would be able to automatically start filling in that form for you. Has anyone not got that working? Really nice, straightforward one to start, just to make sure everyone's got the code in the right place and is able to see changes they're making. That worked for everyone? If you inspect the DOM, you should see the autocomplete values. So nothing visible should have changed. Like I said, just a nice, easy first step to make sure that everyone's able to get the code updating in the browser. The next thing we're going to start working towards is the ability to submit the form directly from the browser. We'll do that with fetch rather than a normal form post. That, from a user experience point of view, might allow us to do something like a fancy page transition once you've logged in successfully. It might allow us to show a progress bar if you have a more complex login flow, for example. And it's a pattern that we tend to see a lot more these days. It makes the experience feel smoother from a user's point of view rather than having to wait for the whole page reload. So to do that, we're going to need to have a look at how we're handling the form posts in our Express app. So in index.js, src index.js, you can see in the post route handler that if the username and password were correct, we're currently redirecting to the dashboard route. And this res.format method is how Express handles different accept headers from the browser. So if the request from the browser says, I am expecting and I can only handle HTML in response, then that's what we'll give it. Currently, if the request from the browser says, I want or I can only handle JSON, for example, there's no way to do that, and Express will throw an error. So it's worthwhile thinking about things like that when you're building a form or a page, that the back end of a form, of what kind of data is the client going to be expecting. Like I said, here we can only handle HTML currently, and the request from the client, when we do a form submission, if I clear this, and I got the preserve on, if I log in, so we can see that we are accepting text/HTML. The content type that we expect back is HTML. We want to change that so that we can handle JSON responses. So what we're going to do is update our post route handler here to say that we can now handle JSON responses. So if we add a function in there, we can then respond to the client with JSON. This void convention, I don't know why I've put it in here. I picked it up a long time ago, and just when I'm using an arrow function that doesn't have curly braces around the body, I tend to use void before the expression to show that I am not intending to do anything with the return value because of the implicit return without the curly braces. You don't really need it there. It's just a habit I picked up a while ago. So in this case, we can respond to the client with some JSON. In Express, on the response object, there is a JSON method. And we can pass that an object, and we can just say, for example, yeah, you're logged in. Success, true. We might want to do the same for the failure response down here. In the default case, if the condition above, if the condition here evaluates to false, we'll end up down here. And we'll need to be able to handle JSON responses here too. So we could set a status, an HTTP status code again if we like, 401 being unauthorized. And here we can we're already setting up some data to send back to the client. Previously, we're passing it through to the view renderer, but in this case, we'll be able to just send it straight back to the client as JSON. Does anyone need a bit more time to write that out? Cool. Now we can get to the client-side part and start actually making our form do something a bit more exciting. So, in the public scripts app.js file, there's nothing there at all at the moment. What we want to do is write a function. So let's start with a function called login, which takes a form. And we want to make a request to the server, asking for JSON in response to take advantage of that response type we've just added in Express. And to do that, we're going to use fetch, because it's new and exciting and much, much quicker and easier than something like XML HTTP request. So from this function, we're going to return the request. We're going to make the request to the root path, because that's where we've set up the post route handler. And because it's a post route handler, we need to tell fetch to make that request as a post. We need to tell the server that we want JSON in response. We do that with the accept HTTP header, which needs a value of application JSON, that being the content type for JSON. Is everyone comfortable with the concepts I'm talking about for HTTP headers and content types. Does anyone want any more detail around that? Okay. Sure. So when the browser sends a request to the server, so when we click that submit button on the form, where's the browser gone? The request has various, I guess you could just call it metadata associated with it that the server can use to determine how to handle that request. So in this case, this is the request from, this was me clicking the submit button on the form. The request headers, so effectively just metadata associated with the request. There's one for accept, which the one I've been talking about a little bit, which is intended to tell the server what the client is expecting in return. There are all sorts of other headers, some that you might have seen before, such as, it's down off the bottom of the screen because of the resolution of the thing and I can't scroll. Let me pop this out. So, for example, there's a user agent header that identifies the browser making the request. The host header is an important one that shows where the request came from. So an HTTP header it's part of the HTTP protocol that is designed so that the server can understand how best to handle the request from the client. Does that make sense? So yes, so this then, what Express does internally is it sends a response back to the client, which tells the browser to redirect to this path, which we can see in the response. The response code being 302, which is a redirect response code. So the browser then follows the response to the dashboard page which we've told it to redirect to. So in the response headers, just as we set our own headers on the request to the server has then set that location header, which along with a status code of 302 means please redirect onwards to this location header. We would get the result of the redirect. So it's worth trying that. If you change that, you should just get the HTML back in the response. So we're not actually making the request with fetch yet. So once we get to that point, if you just change that accept header to text/HTML and you try and make the request again, you should just get in response the HTML for the dashboard page rather than whatever JSON you are returning here. Cool. So something else we need in our request will be some data, so a body to the request. So as well as having things like headers as metadata, a post request can have a body which contains data from the client, which the server will process in some way. And we want to use the data from our form as the request body. So here I'm using the form data constructor, which is another fairly new web API, which takes a form node, form element effectively, and it returns an object with key value pairs of corresponding to the fields within that form. So this form data object, if form here was a reference to our login form element, the form data object should contain key value pairs for the username field and the password field. And that's just a simpler way of doing something like manually setting up the object with keys and having to pull out individual values from the form, like we might have had to do in the past, something like that. The form data constructor is just a nice, quick way of getting the values from a form into an object. And we need one final piece of configuration on that fetch request, which is credentials, which we just need to set to include. Credentials in the fetch options is a slightly misleading name. What this is actually going to do with our request is allow us to set cookies or receive cookies or send cookies, sorry. If we don't set credentials to include, then any cookies that are set against the domain we're running on will not be sent to the server with this request, and any cookies that are sent back from the server will not get set in the browser. So we can use include there, or we can use same origin, which is potentially safer because it means only cookies from the same origin will be sent with the request. So we are sending it as directly as form data, so it won't actually be sent as JSON. It will send it as a form, like as a form content type, and that's being passed, if you're interested in that, by a piece of middleware called Malta in Express, which handles various encodings sent along with a request. It passes that out into exactly, but it handles multi-part forms as well as XURL encoded or whatever. I can never remember the actual name, but yeah. Once we've made that request, fetch returns a promise. I think everyone has been talked over and over and over again about promises over the last 3 days, so hopefully everyone is comfortable with promises. Fetch returns a promise which resolves with a response object, and the response object has various methods that allow us to pull out data from that response in a format that we need, effectively. So we need to say we want JSON from that response. That again returns a promise. So another then, and in that one we should have some JSON from the server. I'll give everyone a minute or so just to catch up. Is everyone comfortable with what that is doing, or what that will be doing when we call it? It's a stream, yeah. Yeah, so fetch, I'm not entirely clear on the internals of it, but yeah, it will have the response from fetch has methods corresponding to different content types, effectively. So we could do res.text and it will convert that, it will buffer it into a text, into a string. We can buffer it into an object and so on. So it should, when we run it shortly, the res.json call And then this JSON here should be an object that matches whatever you're responding with here. So in this case, my case, JSON here will have, for example, a success property. And if it has that success property, then we know that the user was logged in successfully. And we can then, because this is just a demo again, we'll just redirect the user onwards. So we're kind of mimicking what the server would have done. But like I said earlier, there's all sorts we could do there. We could do some flashy page transition or dynamically load in some new data and so on. But for now, we'll just explicitly redirect the user onwards again by changing the URL. So here, do you mean? In No. So this function here is what Express on the server is using to respond to requests that accept JSON. The names just happen to be the same. So we make a request that says it will accept JSON in response. Express receives that request. The request matches the path that the request was made to, matches this root handler, the root, the slash. And because we've said we're accepting JSON in response, it will run this JSON function to respond to the client. And then another function called JSON on the response object itself. So res here is Express's kind of, it's the object you interact with to configure what gets sent back to the client. And we're just saying, send JSON back to the client. I know there are like 5 different functions now called JSON, but yeah. So then on the client-side JavaScript, we get the response from fetch, and we are passing it again into JSON. And if we have a success property, or make sure that corresponds to something that you've set yours to respond with, then we can redirect the user. Otherwise, we can show an error message. I'll do a really simple one. So if we have a function now that's able to do that, let's make use of that. If you're not caught up, don't worry. We'll have a small pause to catch up once we've got this being called. The login form is available with an ID of login-form. So if we get a reference to that, we can bind a submit event handler to that. And we can say, prevent the default action of a submit event being a form submission. So we're saying, don't actually submit the form because we want to do our own thing with it. Yes, thank you. And we can then call our login function with that form. So we can just use that reference again, or you could use the target from the event object. Should work the same way. And with that, with a bit of luck as well, you should now be able to restart that server in your terminal where you ran npm start. If you restart that and go back to the browser, the form should submit with that fetch request rather than a form post. And we've done it in a way that means if JavaScript's disabled, for example, we can still handle that default text HTML accept type. So anyone with JavaScript disabled will still get logged in like normal. So has everyone got that working? Does anyone not have it working? Does anyone want a hand with anything? Yeah. If you want to automatically catch up to that point, if you're not happy with what you've got, if you can check out the branch exercise -2, and you should have something along those lines already written for you, ready to go. So now that we're able to submit the form with fetch, we can finally start to actually think about the Credential Management API. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tell the browser that the user has successfully authenticated and that it might like to suggest to the user that it saves those credentials that have just been used to successfully log in. So we're already detecting whether or not the user has successfully logged in because we get it back in that JSON response. So inside there, before we redirect onwards to the dashboard page, we can do something different. So we can use a feature detection flag to see if the Credential Management API is supported, first of all. And we do that with this navigator.credentials object. If it exists, then the browser should support the Credential Management API. So the navigator object, I'm sure you've all seen and used, but holds various methods and bits of data that represent kind of the state of the browser. And the majority of what we'll use within the Credential Management API all hangs off of navigator.credentials. Unrelated to the credentials here, which is why I think this is slightly misleadingly named, the credentials as part of the fetch options, which really is only used for arbitrary cookies. It's not strictly tied to credentials in any way. So if the browser does support navigator.credentials, we can suggest that it stores the credentials that we know are valid, that the user has just used to log in. And to do that, we need to create a credential instance. So this is another new addition, the global password credential constructor, which takes a form node So what we're saying is create a password credential instance from the form node. The browser then internally pulls out the values from the form based on the IDs of the fields. So those two form fields already have an ID of username and an ID of password, which are the default IDs that the password credential constructor expects to find in a form node. So when this is instantiated, we will end up with an object of type password credential with a username and a password field that correspond to the values in the username and the password form fields. That is configurable. I think it's just another option to the password credential object, but we shouldn't need to do that right now because the form has the correct IDs. And once we have that, we can ask the browser to store that credential. So navigator.credentials.store. Store is one of the three methods. We'll come across the other two later, but one of the three methods available via navigator.credentials. And as it's named, it suggests to the browser that we would like to store the credential. It returns a promise, the reason being that the browser may need to do something asynchronously, like suggest to the user, do you want to allow this site to remember, well, do you want to allow me to remember the credentials you used for this site? And that promise, the promise will always be resolved whether with undefined, no matter what the user does. So we don't have to handle the response from that promise. There will never be anything other than undefined because from our point of view, it doesn't matter whether the user has said, yes, you can remember the password, or no, you can't remember the password. We can handle both flows seamlessly. So to us, it makes no difference whether or not the user does agree to save their password. It will only have an impact when we try and retrieve it later. We'll come on to that shortly. So that should be all we need to suggest that we store the credentials. If the Credential Management API is not supported and we are in the success flow, then we can just redirect onwards normally. There's no need to do anything different there. But if it is supported, then store the credential, and regardless of the response, like I said, the promise will always resolve, redirect onwards in that case. So if you've got that written, you should now be able to run the application, and when you log in, you should get Chrome suggesting to you that you might want to save the username and password. You should get just a little pop-up like you've probably seen before when you submit a form, but this time we are suggesting to the browser that it offers that rather than using the default behavior of a normal form submission. So I'll give you all a couple of minutes to get that working. Let me know if you need a hand or have any questions, and Marco as well. The question was, where is the credential stored? The credentials are stored in the browser's existing credential store. So just how if we had a normal default form, when Chrome or any browser already says, do you want to remember your username and password, stored in the same place. So in the case of Chrome, that's a SQLite database just on the disk. I can't remember the exact location, especially within the VM, but you can go and see that they're stored encrypted in that, just in a database on disk. When Chrome autofills, or when we manage to get the password, as we'll see shortly via the Credential Management API, Chrome decrypts the password and hands it off to the page effectively. So it's just interfacing with the existing browser credential store. While you're playing around with all this, it might be helpful to clear the stored password so that you're able to kind of run through the whole flow from scratch as many times as you like. So Chrome puts all this in settings. So if you go to Chrome //settings, or you can probably get there from the toolbar. And you scroll right down to the bottom, which you can't see, and I can't see in this resolution. And you click Advanced. It expands a whole bunch of stuff, one of which is this passwords and forms section. And if you expand in there, manage passwords, you'll have a section of saved passwords. And if you've got a credential saved against localhost already, you should be able to clear it. I haven't run it on this, so it's not there, but if I go through it as well, in fact, let's just... it hasn't asked me, I'm not sure. But yeah, it should appear under that saved passwords section, and you should be able to delete it and then start the whole flow from scratch.
Is it possible that it's because of the redirect? Like it's not even every time to show the option to save the password?
So the redirect should be inside the then. And the second one should be outside of the if, outside of the feature detection for navigator.credentials. So
Because I added an alert.
is anyone actually seeing the pop-up in Chrome that says that asks if you'd like to save the credential? Yeah?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so it probably is a typo on yours. Let's make sure. Yeah, I'm not getting it either.
Maybe there is some other setting.
It shouldn't matter because of the return. There we go. Try it with a fresh Chrome profile. There probably is some setting somewhere that. If you are having problems getting the little pop-up to display at all, try creating a new Chrome profile, which will have a completely new set of settings, and nothing that you might have possibly changed at some point will be interfering. So you can do that by clicking on the little tab in the top right and click Manage People, and you can add a new person and browse in a completely clean profile with completely clean settings. Okay, are we ready? Is everyone back? I think most people are back. So, while I remember, because Evo literally just told me now, there will be a group photo of everyone across all the tracks just before the closing keynote outside on the terrace. So we'll try and finish up here 5-10 minutes before 5 o'clock so everyone can go over for the group photo and then onto the closing keynote. So, before the break, we had our login form, and we had it saving the credentials once you've successfully authenticated. So, the logical next step from there is to be able to retrieve those credentials at the time of the page load, so that we may not have to actually show the login form to the user at all. So to do that, we're going to use the counterpart to the store method on navigator.credentials. So the JavaScript file that we have, the client-side JavaScript file, is loaded at the bottom of the DOM, so it will run it will run at the right time. So we can just down at the bottom. I've now wrapped all this in a check to make sure we're actually on the login page. You may want to do the same to prevent it erroring out when it fails to find the login form to bind an event listener to. So let's start by, if you haven't already, just wrap everything that you have so far in that if login form. And we will then, still inside that if, we'll need another feature detection. Obviously, you could abstract that away, put it in a constant somewhere, variable up at the top, but it's simple enough that I wouldn't worry. And we can then use the get method, which is the counterpart to the store method. And get requires a very small amount of configuration to say which type of credential that we want. So in this case, we've been working with a password credential. So we need to say that we want a password credential. Like I said at the beginning, the API also works with federated credentials. We would be able to extend this here to say we can handle a password credential or a federated credential. At the moment, we only support the password credential. So again, the get method returns a promise, which resolves with a credential if the browser has one. If the browser doesn't have one, then it will resolve with undefined. So we can have a simple condition to say if we have a credential, then good, we can submit it. If we don't have a credential, we can pretty much do nothing at all because the form will be rendered as usual. The user can submit the form like usual, and the user will then be asked to save their password like usual. So it makes no difference to us if we have a credential or not. But if we do, then we can build up some form data. So this time, rather than creating one from the form itself, we're building one up manually. And we're using some properties of that credential object that the browser has given us to populate that form data object. So form data has an append method, which adds a field into the form data. The first argument is the name of the field, and the second argument is the value for the field. The name for the field is the name that's stored against the credential ID. In our case, that's the username. The ID name has come from the input itself. And we can do the same for password. So we've built up a form data object that is pretty much the same as it would have been had the user filled in the form and click submit, like what we had here already in the login function. So with that form data, we can hand it off to our login function. Although you may have noticed that will require a minor change because we're passing the whole form to form data here. So we just need to check whether or not we already have form data. And if we already have form data, we don't need to instantiate it again. And that also then means if we have a form data instance already, we know that the user had a saved credential, because in the other case, we know that we'll have a form node. So we're kind of using that difference to detect the mechanism by which we've received the credential. If we're calling login with the form itself, we know that it's been a form submission. If we're calling login with a form data instance, then we know that we've received the credential from the Credential Management API. You could obviously do that in another way. It might have been more explicit to pass some flag or something into that login function, but I'm not sure why, but this is the way I went. So we also now know that if we have form data, then we don't need to save the credential again because the browser's just given it to us. There's no need to restore it. So we can bypass the navigator.credentials.store part by checking whether or not we have a form data instance already. Which no, because it's a different scope. So here. Yes, I do. Good spot, thank you. So if you now run that, if you've left it as it was from before the break, you should have, when you go to the login page, you should automatically get logged in. Chrome may ask you whether or not you want to have the ability to automatically log in. It may have already turned that on by default. So if I run that here in, which one do I need? In this profile, so Chrome asks me now if I would like to sign in with the stored credential. And if I click sign in, it's automatically handed those credentials over and we've sent them straight to the server. It's now asked me if I'd like to, well, it's telling me that it has automatically turned on auto sign in and given me the option to turn it off if I like. So if I don't turn that off, leave it enabled, and I log out and log back in, the login page we don't need it at all. And Chrome has notified, if you notice in the top right, it's notified me that it's automatically signing me in with that credential. So I'll give you a few minutes to get to that point. Has anyone not got there, or has anyone got any issues? Cool. So, you may have noticed that we now have a little bit of a problem from a user's point of view. The problem is now if you clear your cookies, so you're logged out, and you visit the login page. So I'm trying to log out. I'll be automatically logged back in. No matter what I do, unless I change the Chrome settings, I'm going to be logged back in. So from a user's point of view, that's not great. It might be good from a business point of view if you're measuring like logins or something, but I don't think your users will appreciate it. So fortunately, there is one more method on the navigator.credentials object that we can use to help with this situation. So let's first of all add a logout function to our application, so we don't have to keep clearing this cookie over and over again. So to do that, we're going to have to jump back into the server-side code, and we'll add a new route handler, which handles GET requests to something sensible like logout. And all this route needs to do is clear the cookie for us to save us the trouble of having to do it manually every time. And then we'll redirect back to the login page. So I'll give you a minute or two just to get that down. So all that's really happening here is when we request the logout route, Express will set the cookie header appropriately to tell the browser to remove the access token cookie from the browser. And then it sends a redirect response, so a 302 onwards to the /, which is either the login page or it's the login page. So the browser will remove the cookie, and it will then follow the redirect on to /. Obviously, that's mimicking exactly what we've just been doing manually in the browser. So it's doing that. So it's still going to suffer from the same problem. Remove cookie and redirect to the default, the home base route, and we'll get automatically signed in. So let's now add a link to the dashboard page to call that sign out route. Apologies again for the use of a templating language that many of you may not have used, but we can add a logout link with an A, just the first character on its own will, well, the first token represents the tag in Pug. And let's give it an ID. How do I do a hash inside this VM? I mean, how do I physically type a hash inside the virtual appliance on a Mac? I'll copy one. Sorry?
Or you can just use the property IG.
Oh, I could. Yeah, good idea. I've got it now, copied and pasted. So let's call that logout, and we'll point to our new logout route. And if you put a space and then some text, that just becomes the text of the element. So once you've got that, you will unfortunately have to restart the server. So here in my example, we should now have a logout link down at the bottom. And when we call it, we get logged out and we get automatically signed back in. Has anyone not got to that point? Yes. Which file? That part? Cool. I'll give it a couple more minutes if people are still trying to get that bit sorted. Okay. So now that we have our link and it has an ID, we can again bind an event handler to it. So let's just get a reference to that link. I can't remember what I called it. I think I just called it logout. So just with get element by ID, we can get a reference to the element. And let's just make sure that we have one so that the code doesn't run on the login form, only the page with the logout link. We can add a click event handler. And in there, yet another feature detection. And the final method of that interface, navigator.credentials, is prevent silent access, which we can just call. We don't care about the return value. We can just call that, and it will effectively say to the browser, don't automatically log the user in again during this session. So let's give it another minute. No, just a browser session. If you close the tab and you reopen it, that's a new session. No, no, you'd have to close the tab or the window. So with that, when I refresh the page and log out now, Chrome will ask me if I want to sign in rather than automatically signing me in. So we no longer have that terrible pattern of automatically signed in as soon as I've tried to sign out. So that is effectively the extent of the Credential Management API for a password journey. That's we now all have a working, well, we almost all have, apart from some very interesting bugs near the front, an end-to-end journey of signing in, remembering the credentials, retrieving the credentials, and signing out. So that's good, but we can enhance it one step further by considering federated credentials, like I mentioned at the beginning. So for the next kind of like half an hour maybe, I was going to try and do this a bit more freeform because the internet connection is actually pretty good. I didn't want to have to rely on it, but now since we do have it, let's make the most of it. So feel free to pair up. Myself and Marco will be around and we'll wander around and sit down with some people and help out as well. You can use Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, and Google. All four OAuth libraries work. I didn't want to prescribe one because not everyone may have an account from all of them. But if you have an account on one of those platforms and you'd like to try and implement federated credential support for the platform of your choice, I will go around the room and help out where I can. So what we'll need for that is to extend, we'll need to extend the saving of credentials. We'll need to handle federated credentials. There is a separate constructor of federated credential. And we'll need to handle the retrieving of credentials to say that we accept federated credentials of various types. So there is documentation for this. There's a fairly good guide in the Google Developer Docs. Can everyone see that URL? I'll put this in Slack now. So yeah, if you'd like to pair up, that would be good to see some pair programming going on, and have a go at implementing, well, extending what we already have to offer federated credential support for a platform of your choice. Are you just happy to help with anyone that I didn't want to enforce this part, because if the internet hadn't been down and everyone needs a connection to GitHub or Facebook or Twitter, so yeah, I've been very impressed with the whole conference actually. It's worked well. So I think in the documentation that I pasted a link to, there are some good examples of using Google OAuth. So feel free to try that for the quick win. But it would be cool if anyone can get Twitter or something else working as well. It would be quite good to see. So if anyone is not getting started yet with this, then I think one of the first things that you'll need, and this is why I wasn't necessarily banking on this working, but since we do have internet, we can go with it. You'll need to create an OAuth application with your chosen provider. So, for example, GitHub. I can never remember the path to it, but you'll have to register a new OAuth application. And then from there, you'll be able to use that application to authenticate users effectively. So you're then delegating trust to your OAuth application registered with the provider. So the example of that in the documentation I showed you is using the Google library. GitHub may provide the same thing. Oh, I've never actually tried it with GitHub. It may be easier to use the Google one that's in there if you have a Google account. Does anyone know if there is a like similar to the Google JS platform, if GitHub provides something similar for OAuth login? I've never actually tried to use GitHub OAuth. Yeah. So if you do have a Google account, you might find it easier to use this guide to set up a Google application effectively, so that you can get hold of the application key, which you'll need to load the relevant API. Well, you'll need to communicate with the API. I'll paste this guide into Slack as well. Once you have an OAuth application, it should be a matter of pulling in the Google JavaScript library, and then using that to determine whether or not you have a signed-in user, and then hooking that into the login function that you've already written inside the app. So if you've created a Google application, you'll get given a client ID and secret, which you can then use as per the Google sign-in guide. So would anyone like some help creating a Google OAuth application, or is everyone on the right track?